I think after that, I started replaying things differently. Not obsessively. Not in the way people imagine after a breakup, where every memory feels sharp or accusatory. It was quieter than that. More like my mind kept returning to ordinary scenes, trying to understand when importance turns into familiarity, and when familiarity quietly becomes absence. I'd remember evenings that once felt intimate. Us sitting on opposite ends of the couch, legs touching without thinking about it. The TV playing something neither of us really cared about. Her occasionally looking over just to tell me a thought that had nothing to do with what we were watching. At the time, those moments felt full. Later, remembering them, I realized what made them meaningful wasn't proximity. It was interruption. We used to interrupt our own lives for each other. A thought would appear, and the instinct was immediate. Tell them. Somewhere along the way, that instinct faded. I don't think either of us noticed when we stopped doing that. Thoughts stayed internal longer. Stories waited until later. Later turned into summaries. Summaries turned into silence. And silence, when shared long enough, starts to feel normal. After she moved out, I kept expecting loneliness to arrive in a recognizable way. Movies teach you what heartbreak should look like. Sleepless nights, constant longing, the urge to call. But what I felt instead was adjustment. The apartment didn't feel emptier so much as clarified. Her absence revealed how much emotional space had already existed before she left. I noticed practical things first. Only one mug used in the morning. No background movement in another room. No second rhythm moving alongside mine. But emotionally, it was stranger. I wasn't missing conversations we used to have near the end. I was missing the version of us from earlier, the one where attention felt automatic. That distinction took time to understand. I didn't miss her presence. I missed being someone whose presence mattered instinctively. There were nights I caught myself reaching for my phone. Something small would happen. A coworker saying something ridiculous. A song playing in a store that reminded me of nothing specific. And my first impulse was still to tell her. Not because I wanted her back, because she had once been the place my thoughts landed. When you lose that, the silence afterward feels unfamiliar. You realize how much of intimacy lives inside tiny, unnecessary sharing. Not emergencies, not milestones, just participation. I think that's when the idea settled deeper. Replacement doesn't mean someone else steps into your exact role. It means life reorganizes around your absence faster than you expected. Friends fill conversations. Work expands. New habits grow. And eventually, the emotional space you occupied closes without ceremony. The same thing was happening in my life too. I began talking to other people more. Calling friends I hadn't spoken to in months. Staying out longer without feeling obligated to report back. At first it felt like freedom. Then something more complicated followed. Awareness. I understood that I wasn't uniquely difficult to lose either. My life adjusted just as naturally without her. That realization didn't feel cruel. It felt human, and somehow heavier because of that. I stopped framing the relationship as something that failed. Failure suggests a mistake. Something preventable. But nothing obvious had been neglected. We cared about each other. We were kind. We tried, in the ways we understood at the time. What disappeared wasn't love overnight. It was attention sustained over years. Curiosity requires energy, and comfort quietly convinces you energy is no longer necessary. You assume connection will maintain itself. It doesn't. It slowly defaults to routine, and routine rarely announces when intimacy leaves. Months later, I noticed something about myself that surprised me. I started paying attention to how people listened. Not dramatically, just small things. Do they ask follow-up questions? Do they remember details later? Do conversations expand naturally or end efficiently? I realized I had begun measuring connection through curiosity. Because curiosity is effort disguised as interest, and effort means presence. I didn't become cynical. If anything, I became softer. More aware of how fragile emotional centrality really is. No one remains irreplaceable automatically. Not because people are disposable, because life keeps moving, and movement reshapes attachment constantly. Sometimes I wonder if she ever had the same realization. If there was a moment when she understood I was no longer essential to her daily emotional landscape. Maybe she noticed before I did. Maybe we arrived there at the same time. I'll never know. And strangely, I don't need to. There's no resentment attached to that uncertainty, just acceptance. Two people can love each other sincerely and still drift into separate lives without betrayal. That used to feel impossible to me. Now it feels ordinary. These days, when I think about relationships, I notice something different. I don't look for intensity. I don't look for permanence. I look for movement. Does conversation wander? Do we interrupt ourselves to share something meaningless? Do we still wonder who the other person is becoming? Because once wondering stops, replacement begins quietly. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. Just naturally. I still think about her sometimes. Usually in passing. A restaurant we used to go to. A street we walked often. But the memory doesn't pull at me the way it once might have. It feels complete. Like remembering a place you once lived. Important. Real. But no longer yours. And when I think back now, the realization that stayed wasn't painful in the way heartbreak is supposed to be. It was humbling. Understanding that importance isn't permanent. That closeness survives only while two people continue choosing attention. That being loved once doesn't guarantee being needed forever. I realized I was easier to replace than I thought. And strangely, that understanding didn't make me feel smaller. It made me more careful, more aware, more present when connection actually exists. Because now I know how quietly it can fade, how gently someone can move from central to familiar, to memory, and how life keeps going afterward, almost seamlessly, which might be the hardest truth of all. After a while, I stopped thinking about replacement in such a literal way. At first, the idea bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not because I imagined her with someone else. That wasn't really it. It was realizing how naturally people reorganize their emotional lives. I used to believe closeness created permanence. That once two people knew each other deeply enough, something lasting formed automatically. But memory doesn't work like that. Neither does attachment. You don't wake up one day and decide someone matters less. You just stop orienting your thoughts toward them. And one day you notice you haven't thought to share something in weeks. There was a moment, months later, when I understood this more clearly. I was walking home after work. Nothing unusual about the day. Same route I'd taken hundreds of times. A street musician was playing near the corner cafe. He wasn't especially good, but something about the song caught me off guard. Familiar enough to trigger recognition, distant enough that I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. My first instinct was still automatic. She'd like this. The thought appeared fully formed. And then, almost immediately, another realization followed. I didn't reach for my phone. Not because I stopped myself. Because the impulse ended before action. There was no expectation anymore that she belonged inside that moment. That's when I understood something had actually changed. Not when we broke up. Not when she moved out. But when sharing stopped feeling natural. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. People passed around me. Conversations layered over the music. Traffic moved normally. Everything continued. And I felt strangely calm. The absence of urgency surprised me. I wasn't suppressing emotion. I simply wasn't connected to her daily reality anymore. And she wasn't connected to mine. That's when acceptance finally arrived, quietly, without announcement. We hadn't replaced each other. We had just continued living. I think what unsettled me most at the beginning was realizing how much identity hides inside relationships. You don't notice it forming. You become someone who updates another person automatically. Someone whose experiences feel incomplete until shared. Someone who exists slightly reflected through another mind. When that reflection disappears, there's a brief period where your thoughts feel unfinished. Like sentences without listeners. I went through that longer than I expected. Small victories felt oddly private. Bad days ended without narration. Even happiness felt quieter. Not worse. Just unshared. And slowly, I learned something uncomfortable. Life doesn't pause while you rebuild emotional orientation. It keeps offering moments anyway. I started forming new habits without deciding to. Calling friends more often. Staying after conversations instead of leaving early. Letting silence exist without assuming disinterest. I noticed myself becoming curious again. About people. About conversations. About possibilities that didn't revolve around maintaining stability. It wasn't dramatic growth. Just subtle re-expansion. Like circulation returning to a limb you didn't realize had fallen asleep. Sometimes I wondered whether we could have prevented it. If earlier honesty might have interrupted the drift. If naming distance sooner would have changed direction. But every time I imagined those conversations, something felt incomplete. Because the truth is, neither of us had stopped caring intentionally. We had stopped noticing gradually. And awareness can't be forced retroactively. You either feel curiosity, or you remember when it existed. By the time we recognized the absence, We were already living beyond it. I don't think love disappears cleanly. It redistributes. Parts of it remain as familiarity, as goodwill, as quiet respect. But the active part, the reaching, fades first. And once reaching stops, connection becomes memory maintained by habit. We stayed kind to each other until the end. That still matters to me. There was no damage to repair afterward, no anger to carry forward, just understanding arriving late. But honestly, these days, when I meet someone new, I notice something subtle. I pay attention to whether conversation feels alive. Not exciting. Alive. Do thoughts interrupt naturally? Do we want to keep explaining things even after they're understood? Does curiosity exist without effort? I don't chase intensity anymore. Intensity can exist without depth. What I recognize now is attention, sustained attention, the quiet desire to keep discovering someone even after familiarity forms. Because familiarity alone isn't connection. I learned that slowly. Every once in a while, I still think about the version of myself who believed importance was permanent. He wasn't naive, just hopeful. He thought being deeply known secured a lasting place in someone's life. Now I understand something softer. Importance isn't fixed. It's renewed continuously, or it fades naturally, and neither outcome requires blame. I don't feel replaceable in a painful way anymore. I feel temporary in a human way. And strangely, that makes connection feel more meaningful now, because attention becomes a choice. Presence becomes intentional. Nothing is guaranteed, which makes noticing each other matter more while it lasts. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how ordinary our ending was. No defining scene, no dramatic goodbye, just two lives gradually separating until continuation together required more effort than letting go. And maybe that's why it took me so long to understand what happened. Nothing collapsed. Nothing demanded urgency. We simply stopped being central to each other's internal worlds. And life continued. Quietly. Efficiently. Almost gently. I still don't know exactly when I became easier to replace than I thought. Maybe everyone is. Maybe closeness always exists on borrowed time unless actively renewed. I don't find that depressing anymore. Just honest. Because now, when someone asks how my day was, and actually waits for the answer, I notice. And when I find myself wanting to tell someone something small, unnecessary, completely insignificant, I notice that too. Those instincts feel fragile now, but also real. And maybe that's enough. Not permanence. Not certainty. Just two people choosing, for as long as it lasts, to keep each other in mind. Until one day they don't. And life moves forward again. Quietly. Like it always does.